On the morning of July 8, 1944, American officers stepped onto a battlefield on the island of Saipan and found a scene that challenged every rule of war they had ever learned. They were staring at the aftermath of the largest suicidal Bonsai assault of the entire Pacific War. The ground looked like a shattered world, painted with mud, blood, broken helmets, and twisted bodies. Yet among all this horror, one single spot froze the senior commanders in place. It was a small forward aid station, a simple medical tent built for treating the wounded, and inside it, they found a man slumped over a heavy machine gun. His name was Captain Benjamin Salomon. He was not a ranger. He was not a hardened Marine. He was not even supposed to be in direct combat. He was a dentist, a man whose life had been spent repairing teeth, removing cavities, and giving people reasons to smile. Now he lay still with 76 visible wounds from bullets and bayonets, while around him and blocking the entrance to the tent were the bodies of 98 Japanese soldiers. 98 enemies killed by one man who was supposed to be pulling teeth instead of defending a battlefield. The officers could not believe the sight. It felt impossible that a dentist could stand alone against almost 100 attackers and hold them back. It made no sense at all. How could a man trained to save lives end up taking so many in one desperate final stand? To understand this moment, to understand how a gentle man from Milwaukee became the deadliest defender on SAPE, and we have to travel back to his beginnings long before the night that turned him into legend. Benjamin Salomon was born in Milwaukee, and if you had seen him in 1937, you would have thought he was the last person on Earth who would ever fire a weapon in war. He was calm, quiet, respectful, a young man who followed rules and worked hard. He earned Eagle Scout honors. He wrote letters home. He studied dentistry at the University of Southern California and worried about exams and root canals while the world outside edged closer to conflict. Friends described him as dependable and kind, the sort of neighbor everyone trusted. Nothing about him suggested violence. Nothing hinted at the fury that would one day erupt on a battlefield far away. When the draft reached him in 1940, he did not fight it. He joined the army, and something strange happened almost immediately. During basic training, this quiet dentist picked up a rifle and shocked everyone around him. He hit every target. He passed every marksmanship test. He was an expert with a rifle. Then he picked up a pistol and achieved the same level of mastery. His officers could not understand how someone so gentle could shoot with such perfect control. But the army looked at his education and made a decision. They said his hands were too skilled to be used for a trigger. They said a man who could repair teeth should not be placed on the front line. He was transferred to the Dental Corps. Ben Salomon was assigned to the 105th Infantry Regiment, part of the 27th Infantry Division. The unit often called itself the New York Division, but the Marines who fought beside them used another nickname. They called them the Shopkeepers. The 27th had a reputation for being slower and less aggressive than the battle-hardened Marine divisions. They were seen as soft by some. Ben Salomon was a dentist in a division many believed lacked the violent instinct needed for the brutal island fighting against Imperial Japan. Yet the division was sent to an island that would test even the strongest men alive. The island of Saipan was not just another patch of jungle. It was considered part of the Japanese homeland if America took SAPE, and their new B-29 bombers would be close enough to strike Tokyo. The Japanese High Command understood this, and so did the 31,000 soldiers defending the island. They were given one order that allowed no doubt, no surrender, fight to the last, kill as many Americans as possible before dying. Into this nightmare stepped the dentist from Milwaukee. The landing began on June 15, 1944. Many remember the tragedy of Omaha Beach in Europe, but on SAPE, and the horror was just as great. The Japanese had every inch of the coastline prepared with artillery and mortar fire. When Ben Salomon reached the shore with the 105th Infantry, the waves were already red, but at this moment his job was not to fight. He was supposed to stay behind the front line, set up a clean tent, and handle dental problems caused by heat stress and exhaustion. War, however, does not honor job descriptions. During the first week, the casualties mounted so quickly that the medical teams could not keep up. The battalion surgeon was wounded by shrapnel. His replacement was killed by a sniper almost immediately. Dozens of wounded men poured in with no doctor left to treat them. That was the moment when Ben Salaman took the first step toward the destiny waiting for him on July 8th. He stepped forward and said he could help. He put away his dental tools and picked up a scalpel. He worked 20-hour shifts pulling shrapnel from legs, sewing wounds, and trying to save men who were barely clinging to life. He learned battlefield medicine through blood and fear. Saving lives hardened him. He saw the results of Japanese attacks. He wrote letters for dying soldiers. Every life lost on his table changed him. The gentle dentist was disappearing, and the marksman inside him was waking. By early July, the Americans forced the Japanese into the northern tip of the island, known as the Tanapag Plain. The Japanese were starving out of ammunition and desperate. Logic said they should surrender, but the Imperial Army did not follow logic. They followed a code that demanded death before capture. On July 6th, the sick and exhausted General Sato issued his final order. His men were to launch a massive suicide attack. Every soldier was to kill 10 Americans before dying. That night, the 105th Infantry dug in for what they thought would be a quiet evening. They believed the enemy was broken. They were wrong. Less than 1,000 yards away, thousands of Japanese soldiers and wounded men, and even civilians, were gathering for one last wave. Captain Salaman set up his aid station only 50 yards behind the line with 30 wounded men inside. A deadly silence settled over the plain as night fell. Salaman cleaned his tools, checked his patients, and then he did something no ordinary medical officer would do. He checked his M1 Garand. He loaded a fresh clip. He checked his pistol. Maybe he felt the storm that was coming. Maybe he sensed the ground trembling. The dentist was preparing for war. Ben Salaman was supposed to spend the campaign treating gum infections caused by heat, sweat, and stress, but war does not bend to plans made on paper. The casualties during the first days on Saipan were overwhelming. The American advance across the island was slow and violent, every foot of ground paid for in blood. The Japanese refused to fall back. They fought from caves, from trenches, from hidden bunkers, and every time the 105th Infantry thought the enemy had broken another wave of rifle fire, or mortar shells proved them wrong. Within a matter of days, the battalion surgeon was badly wounded by shrapnel. The replacement surgeon died instantly when a sniper bullet struck him. Suddenly, the regiment had no doctor at all. Dozens, then hundreds of wounded soldiers poured into the aid stations with no one to care for them. That was the moment Ben Salaman changed from dentist to battlefield surgeon. He stepped forward without hesitation and told his commander that he would handle the medical duties. He put his dental mirror away and picked up surgical tools. For week after week, he worked nearly 20 hours each day. He removed jagged metal from bodies. He stitched wounds that tore across arms, legs, and chests. He eased the pain of men who were too badly hurt to save. He learned the brutal rhythm of triage, deciding who might live and who was already lost. He grew used to the sound of soldiers crying out in agony and the quiet moments when their breathing slowed and finally stopped. Every soldier who died under his hands hardened him. Every soldier he saved gave him a deeper sense of duty. The gentle dentist who once worried about exams was gone. A man shaped by the horrors of a Pacific battlefield was emerging. By early July, the American forces had pushed the last surviving Japanese troops into the northern edge of Saipan onto the Tanapag Plain. The Japanese were outnumbered and starving, and many had been reduced to eating bark insects and whatever roots they could dig from the ground. To any normal army, surrender would have been the clear choice. But the Imperial Japanese Army lived under a code that demanded death before defeat. On July 6th, their commander, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Sato, sick weak, and living in a cave, wrote a final order. His men were told that they would advance at once, attack the Americans, and die with honor. He told them each man must kill 10 American soldiers before falling. This was not a tactical plan. It was an instruction for mass suicide. On the American side, the 105th Infantry was moved into the front line along the western coast. Officers believed the enemy was finished. Intelligence reports suggested the Japanese had lost the ability to mount any organized attack. These assumptions were fatally wrong. Less than 1,000 yards from the American perimeter, thousands of Japanese soldiers, wounded fighters, and even civilians were gathering in the ravines. Many carried rifles. Others carried bamboo spears, rocks, or knives tied to sticks. Some dragged themselves on crutches, their heads wrapped in bloody bandages. In total, there were almost 3,000 people preparing to launch themselves at the American line in a single unstoppable tidal wave. Captain Salomon placed his aid station only 50 yards behind the foxholes of the front line because the terrain gave him no other choice. The area was cramped. Steep ravines blocked safer positions. Inside the tent, 30 badly wounded men lay waiting to be evacuated. Supplies were running low. Even morphine was almost gone. As evening approached, a strange silence settled across the Tanapag Plain. Veteran soldiers often say the jungle is never silent unless something is coming. The insects stopped. The wind felt heavy. Many men later said they sensed a storm building beyond the tree line. Inside the tent, Ben Salomon moved from patient to patient, checking dressings, cleaning his instruments, making sure each wounded soldier was stable. Then he did something unusual for a medical officer. He checked his M1 Gar and rifle. He disassembled it, quickly cleaned the parts, and loaded a fresh clip. He checked his pistol. He tightened the strap on his medical bag. Something in him was preparing for the worst, even though the reports claimed the enemy was spent. Maybe he felt the earth vibrating under his boots. Maybe he sensed movement in the dark ravines. Maybe he understood that the silence was too deep to be natural. Long before dawn, the truth arrived. At 4:45 in the morning on July 7th, the sky was still black. The soldiers in the foxholes were half asleep, exhausted from days of battle. Then a low rumble began to rise out of the dark. It sounded like a distant train buried somewhere beneath the earth. The rumble grew into a roar, and then into a scream from thousands of voices at once. Tenno Haika Banzai, long live the Emperor. The largest bonsai charge of the Pacific War had begun. They did not attack in waves. They came as one single mass of bodies stretching across the plain like a living avalanche. The front line of the 105th Infantry collapsed almost instantly. American machine gunners fired until their barrels glowed, but the enemy just climbed over their dead comrades and kept coming. Bayonets crashed against rifles, knives slashed through the darkness, helmets were used as weapons. It was chaos so fast and so savage that men barely had time to scream before they were overrun. Inside the medical tent, Ben Salomon heard everything. He heard the first gunshots, then the thunder of boots, then the awful sounds of bodies falling. The tent flap burst open and a figure stepped inside. It was not an American soldier seeking help. It was a Japanese attacker carrying a rifle with a fixed bayonet. His eyes burned with frenzy. Ben Salomon reacted instantly. He had no weapon in his hands, only a metal medical tray. He grabbed the rifle barrel with one hand, forcing the bayonet aside, and smashed the metal pot into the attacker's face with the other. The man collapsed. Salomon grabbed a nearby rifle lying on a cot and fired 2 rounds into the fallen enemy. The echo of those shots filled the tent. Through the open flap, he saw more silhouettes moving. Many of them. The front line had broken. The enemy was pouring toward the rear. His 30 wounded men were helpless. In that instant, Ben Salomon made a decision that would define his life. He shouted for every man who could walk to leave the tent and head for the rear. He told them he would hold off the attackers. He was one man standing between 30 wounded soldiers and the advancing tide of 3,000 attackers. He filled his pockets with ammunition, picked up his rifle, and stepped outside into a nightmare he knew he was unlikely to survive. Ben Salaman stepped out of the medical tent and into a world drowning in smoke, fire, and screams. The air was thick with the sharp smell of gunpowder mixed with the heavy stench of blood. The sky remained dark, but the battlefield flashed with bursts of muzzle light and the arc of flares dropping slowly from above. What had been a medical area only minutes earlier had become the front line now that the bonsai charge had broken straight through the foxholes ahead. Salaman knew instantly that if the Japanese fighters reached the wounded men retreating behind him, they would be slaughtered without mercy. He stood as the only barrier between the helpless wounded and the oncoming tide. He had no time for fear. His training as a marksman and his weeks of trauma-filled medical duty fused together into a state of sharp, ruthless clarity. His first moments outside the tent were a desperate blur. He did not begin the fight with a machine gun. He started with a rifle picked up from a fallen soldier. He dropped to one knee behind a stack of supply crates and aimed at shadows moving through the smoke. The enemy emerged like ghosts, screaming and charging with bayonets raised. He fired calmly, precisely hitting one, then another, then a third before shifting position and firing again. His hands moved with automatic skill. The muscles that once steadied dental tools were now guiding bullets straight into charging attackers. The noise around him was deafening, but inside himself he was steady, no panic, no hesitation. He could hear the wounded inside the tent trying to crawl away. He could hear the voices of American soldiers up the line crying out as they were overwhelmed. Yet he focused only on the next target. Then he saw movement to the right side of the tent. 4 Japanese soldiers crawled through bushes trying to flank the retreating wounded. Salaman stood fully exposed and fired one shot after another, dropping all 4. But for every man he stopped, more appeared. The sheer number of attackers made the situation hopeless. They were coming in hundreds, maybe thousands, and he was one man with one rifle. He needed something stronger, something that could carve through the human wave before it crashed down on him. Then he saw salvation. 50 yards ahead was an American M1917 Browning Water cooled heavy machine gun set up in a shallow foxhole. Its crew lay dead around it, killed in the first violent seconds of the bonsai assault. The gun sat silent, pointed directly at the heaviest part of the Japanese advance. Salaman did not hesitate. He sprinted across open ground while bullets tore into the dirt around him. The ground shook under his boots as the enemy charge grew closer. He dove into the foxhole, landing hard on top of the fallen machine gunners. There was no time to think about them, no time to grieve. He grabbed the handles of the weapon, feeling the heat radiate from its metal housing. He checked the ammo belt. It was ready. He pulled the charging handle. The gun roared to life. The sound was so loud that it swallowed the screams and explosions around him. It was a deep, steady hammering that filled the air like thunder. A stream of bullets tore into the advancing Japanese forces. The first ranks of attackers collapsed instantly. Those behind them tripped over their bodies. But still they came, more and more. The bonsai charge was a tidal wave of humanity, and the machine gun was a fragile wall struggling to hold it back. Yet in Salaman's hands the gun became something more. A weapon of impossible endurance. A single man operating a machine that normally required a team of several men. He fired with one hand while feeding the belt with the other. He kicked empty ammo boxes aside with his feet. Smoke poured from the barrel, steam hissed from the water jacket. The heavy gun shook violently under the continuous fire, but he held it steady. The Japanese soldiers quickly realized that the machine gun was the anchor point of the American defense. They aimed everything they had at that foxhole. Bullets cracked into the dirt around him. Splinters of wood and metal sliced into his uniform. One bullet struck his leg, tearing through flesh. The pain was sharp, but he barely reacted. He tore a strip of cloth, tied a tight tourniquet, and continued firing. The bonsai charge kept coming. Dozens of enemy soldiers tried to reach the foxhole. Some crawled through the grass trying to get close enough to throw grenades or rush him with bayonets. A small squad managed to sneak around toward his right side. He only saw them when they were 30 yards away. He swung the heavy gun toward them and unleashed a burst, tearing through their bodies. but one soldier managed to throw a grenade. It landed behind him and exploded in a violent burst of fire and dirt. Shrapnel ripped into his shoulder and chest. He was thrown forward onto the weapon. Blood filled his mouth. His ears rang so loudly that the world seemed to fade for a moment. Most people would have fallen unconscious. Most people would have been unable to move after being hit that hard. But Salomon pushed himself back up. His left arm hung limp and useless at his side, but his right arm kept working. He gripped the handles of the machine gun again and fired in short, controlled bursts. He shifted the tripod between firing runs, dragging the heavy weapon to new positions, so the enemy could not target him with mortars. The machine gun weighed more than 100 pounds with its tripod and water jacket, yet he dragged it through the dirt with one functioning arm. Enemy soldiers began to fire mortars toward the flash of his muzzle. He moved again and again, creating the illusion that several machine guns were covering the battlefield. Japanese officers shouted orders, pushing their men forward. They climbed over piles of their own dead, trying to silence the lone gunner who refused to fall. Salomon felt warm blood running down his side. His vision blurred. Dizziness washed over him. But he knew that if he stopped firing the bonds, a wave would sweep through the wounded men still crawling along the rear. He could not stop, not yet. The rising sun began to cast a cold grey light across the battlefield. It revealed a horrible sight. Dozens of enemy bodies lay piled in front of the foxhole. Some were slumped over the barrel. Others lay where they had fallen during earlier rushes. Salomon did not look at them. He only searched for movement, any shape crawling from the darkness, any enemy still coming. He had become a fortress of one man, a wall against an avalanche. And the avalanche was still coming. Ben Salomon kept firing into the mass of attackers as the sky slowly brightened, and the horror of the battlefield became clearer with every passing second. His machine gun thundered without pause, and the recoil shook through his entire body each time he pressed the trigger. The pile of dead enemies in front of the foxhole grew higher until it became a barrier that blocked his line of fire. He shoved bodies aside with his foot, or with his one good arm, just to see the next wave coming. The Japanese soldiers were determined to silence the lone gunner, who had turned their suicide attack into slaughter. Their officers shouted commands and drove them forward through the blood-soaked grass. Some crawled, some limped with bandaged limbs, some ran with bayonets raised. It did not matter how they came. All that mattered was that they kept coming. Salomon knew that if he hesitated even for a heartbeat, the Bonds I charge would spill past him and tear through the wounded men fleeing behind his position. He forced himself to stay focused. Every movement mattered. Every second he held the line saved lives. The heavy machine gun was still operational, but it demanded more than any one man should have been able to give. Normally, a team of several soldiers kept it running. One fired, one fed ammunition, one spotted, one handled cooling water, but Salomon did it all alone. He fed the ammunition belt with one hand while firing with the other. He kicked away empty boxes as they piled up around his feet. He listened to the pitch of the gun and felt the vibration through the handles, so he could tell when the belt was almost empty, even while blood roared in his ears. The attackers focused all their effort on that foxhole. More bullets struck the earth around him. Some ripped into the sandbags. Others whispered past his head close enough to lift the edges of his hair. Then a shot found its mark. A bullet hit his stomach and tore sideways through him. The blow was so violent that he almost collapsed. Hot pain flooded his body and his strength began to drain, but he forced himself back upright. He could feel warm blood soaking through his uniform. He knew the wound was fatal. He knew he did not have long, but he also knew that dying was not the same as stopping. He refused to stop. He leaned forward into the gun and fired another long burst. The machine gun kicked back against his hands. He kept going. At this point, Salomon was no longer fighting to survive. He was fighting to delay the tide long enough for the wounded and the surviving infantry to regroup at the new defensive line. Every minute he held out was another minute the regiment needed. He understood that fully. It fueled him. It kept him locked to the weapon, even as blood loss darkened his vision. soldiers in the enemy ranks began to change tactics. They realized bullets were not stopping him. They began to rush the foxhole in small groups, hoping to overwhelm him through sheer closeness. One group, led by an officer with a raised sword, sprinted across the field. The officer ran at the front screaming orders, while the men behind him pushed forward as fast as they could. Salamon saw them. He waited. He wanted them closer. He waited until he saw the details of their uniforms and the wet shine of sweat on their faces. Then he held the trigger down and let the machine gun roar. The officer fell first, then the men behind him dropped in rapid succession. But one soldier reached the foxhole. He lunged with a bayonet and stabbed Salamon in the side. The steel tore into him with brutal force. Salamon gasped, but he did not let go of the gun. He squeezed the trigger and blasted the attacker away at point-blank range. The impact threw the soldier backward out of the foxhole. Another group of attackers tried to charge him immediately afterward. Again Salamon fired. Again they fell. His hands were slippery with blood. His uniform was torn and soaking. His breath came in short, harsh bursts, but he kept fighting. He shifted his position and dragged the heavy gun to a new angle so mortar crews could not pin him down. He used what strength he had left to pull the tripod into a safer spot. The weapon weighed more than 100 pounds, yet he hauled it by himself while bleeding from more wounds than he could count. The sun continued to rise, turning the battlefield into a grim grey landscape filled with smoke drifting like fog. The Japanese forces pressed their attack more desperately now. They had expected to sweep through the American line. They had not expected to be stopped by one man. They could see him clearly now, a lone figure covered in blood, leaning over a heavy gun that shook violently with each burst. Some must have wondered how he was still alive. Some must have believed they were fighting a demon instead of a human, but no matter how many fell, the attackers kept pushing toward him. Salamon began to run low on ammunition. He had fired thousands of rounds. The machine gun barrel glowed red hot. The water in the cooling jacket boiled away, sending white steam into the air. The steam revealed his position even more clearly. Mortar crews targeted him again. He pressed himself low, then rose to fire another burst. He needed more ammunition, and he needed it fast. Between enemy rushes, he crawled out of the foxhole and moved across the bodies of the American machine gun crew who had died earlier in the attack. He searched their pouches for ammo belts. He crawled to fallen riflemen and pulled grenades and clips from their lifeless hands. Every movement caused pain that ripped through his entire torso, but he ignored it. He dragged everything he found back to the foxhole. As he crawled back, a new bullet struck him in the back. He gasped and nearly collapsed, but he forced himself forward with pure will. He reached the gun again and fed a new belt into the tray. His arms trembled, his legs felt weak, but the moment the belt engaged, he pressed the trigger again. More attackers fell. More bodies piled around him. The ring of the dead rose higher each minute, creating a gruesome wall around the foxhole. Salamon had to shove bodies aside to keep his path clear and maintain his field of fire. The attackers saw him struggle. They screamed and charged again. He met them with another burst from the machine gun. He was running out of time, running out of blood, running out of strength, but he was not running out of resolve, not yet. He would hold this line until the last breath left his body. He would not allow the wounded behind him to be slaughtered. He would not give the bonds. I charge the victory it was designed to take. He would fight until the machine gun fell silent. Ben Salamon kept fighting even as his strength faded, and the battlefield twisted into a nightmare landscape shaped by smoke fire and the bodies of hundreds of fallen attackers. He knew he was bleeding to death. He knew that most men with his wounds would already be unconscious, yet he held on because he understood something greater than his own survival. Every second he fought was a second the wounded men behind him used to escape. Every enemy he stopped was one less soldier who could reach the surgeons, the medics, and the helpless boys crawling away from the collapsing front line. So he stayed behind the heavy machine gun, refusing to surrender his position, even as his vision dimmed and his breath came in short, painful bursts. The machine gun itself was beginning to fail. The barrel glowed like heated metal in a forge. The water in the cooling jacket boiled into steam that drifted upward in white clouds, marking his location to every Japanese soldier still alive. The ground near the foxhole was littered with empty ammo belts and cartridges. The bodies of the fallen enemies had risen into a horrible wall around him, and he had to push them aside constantly to maintain a field of fire. But even through this growing barrier, he could see movement. More attackers crawled through the grass. Some limped forward holding rifles with shaking hands. Others dragged swords or bamboo spears. Some carried grenades. They were wounded, starving, exhausted, and desperate, but their determination to break through did not weaken. Ben Salaman realized he needed more ammunition. Without it, the line would collapse instantly. He crawled out of the foxhole during a brief lull, dragging himself across the open ground where the first machine gun crew lay. He pulled ammo belts from their pouches. He collected rifles, grenades, and anything he could use. Every movement sent a tearing pain through his stomach and his wounded back. Each breath felt like fire inside his chest. Yet he forced himself to continue. He crawled over bodies, he picked up belts, he shoved weapons into his shirt. Then he turned back toward the foxhole. That was when another bullet hit him. It slammed into his back with brutal force, nearly throwing him flat onto the ground. For a moment he could not breathe. He felt the world dim, but then he forced air back into his lungs. He dug his fingers into the dirt. He dragged himself forward one painful inch at a time. He returned to the foxhole and dropped the ammunition beside the machine gun. His legs trembled, his arms felt numb, yet he loaded the next belt and pulled the trigger again. The gun thundered back to life. The Japanese soldiers saw the muzzle flash and rushed toward him once more. Some tried to loop behind him through the ravines. Others charged directly into the killing zone. The machine gun cut them down in lines. Still they came. He heard their screams mixing with the roar of the weapon. He saw their silhouettes racing across the field. He felt the ground shake under their boots, but he did not slow. He did not flinch. He did not pause. He kept the gun alive by sheer force of will. At times he fired in short bursts to conserve the shrinking ammunition supply. At other times he held the trigger down to break a sudden rush. He had long since passed the limits of exhaustion. His body worked only because his mind refused to allow it to stop. He knew the wounded were almost gone now. He had bought them time. He had held the position far longer than anyone could have expected. But he also understood the Bonsai charge had not ended. The Japanese soldiers were gathering again in larger numbers, preparing for one more surge. The grey light of early morning revealed hundreds of them gathering behind the tree line. Officers shouted commands. Soldiers adjusted their bayonets. The final assault was forming. Ben Salaman felt his strength slipping, but he still prepared the foxhole for another fight. He pushed aside bodies for a clearer view. He shifted the machine gun into a more stable position. He reloaded the last ammo belt he had gathered. He adjusted the tripod with a trembling hand. He knew that this belt of ammunition might be his last. He knew that this attack might be the one that reached him, but he also knew he was not done yet, not while he could still move, not while he could still fight. The attackers rushed him again. He opened fire in a sweeping arc, tearing through the first line of soldiers. They fell, the second line stumbled over their bodies, the third pushed forward, stepping on the wounded to reach him. The machine gun rattled violently under his grip, and he held it steady with his fading strength. The heat from the barrel scorched the air around him. His hands blistered against the metal. Still he fired. Then more soldiers tried to flank him from the right. They crawled low through the grass, hoping to reach the foxhole without being seen. But he saw them. He shifted the machine gun and fired again. Bodies collapsed. Another grenade landed near him. It exploded, sending dirt and shrapnel across the foxhole. The blast tore into his leg and ripped part of his uniform away. He was thrown sideways. For a moment he could not hear anything. Then the battlefield sound crashed back over him like a wave. His head pounded. His hands shook. His body was failing, but his spirit did not. He rose again. He pulled himself back to the machine gun. He resumed firing. The ring of dead soldiers around the foxhole had grown so high that he now fought from behind a barricade of bodies. He pushed them aside desperately so he could see the next group approaching. His arms trembled, his breath rattled, his wounds bled freely, but every second he held the line the enemy advance slowed. Every burst from the gun bought more time for the American forces regrouping deeper inland. The attackers knew he was dying. They could see his movements weakening. They could hear the machine gun slowing as the last belt neared its end. But they also knew he would not stop until his final breath. And they feared him. Even dying, he was terrifying. Even at the edge of collapse, he was unstoppable. Ben Salamon had become a wall between the enemy and the helpless men behind him. And he intended to remain that wall until the last heartbeat left his body. The sky continued to brighten as the long night of violence shifted into a grey morning filled with drifting smoke and the metallic smell of blood. Ben Salamon could barely stand, yet he refused to leave the machine gun. He knew the wounded men had escaped. He knew the regiment had fallen back to a safer defensive line. His job was done. But he also understood that the enemy was gathering for one final push, and if he abandoned the foxhole now, even in his dying state, the last surge of Japanese attackers might break through and reach the American rear. So he stayed exactly where he was still gripping the heavy weapon, even as his arms trembled from exhaustion, and his blood-soaked uniform clung to his injuries. His entire body throbbed with pain. His legs felt like they no longer belonged to him. His breaths were shallow and ragged, and each heartbeat felt weaker than the last. Yet he did not crawl away. He did not search for shelter. He did not try to survive. He prepared to fight one final time. He adjusted the tripod of the machine gun with slow, deliberate movements. He checked the feed tray. He lifted the last ammunition belt he had and slid it into place. The metal links rattled as he pulled the belt across the tray. He braced himself behind the weapon and waited. In the quiet moments before the attack, he could hear the faint sounds of Japanese soldiers shouting inside the tree line. They were gathering in the hundreds for a last massive charge. He could feel the earth trembling under their boots even before they emerged. He took a deep breath. The air filled with smoke stung his lungs and made him cough, but he steadied himself again. He knew what was coming. He knew he would not survive it, but he also knew he would not retreat. At 6:45, the final wave burst from the trees. It was a tidal wave of bodies, a swarm of desperate fighters pushing forward with everything they had left. Some ran screaming, some limped, some held bayonets, some carried rocks clubs or makeshift weapons. They no longer looked like a disciplined army. They looked like a human avalanche determined to crush anything in its path. Ben Salamon opened fire. The machine gun chattered violently, spraying bullets into the first ranks of attackers. They fell, but the ones behind them kept coming, climbing over bodies, pressing forward through the smoke. He swept the barrel from side to side, trying to cut down as many as he could. His vision blurred. His hands shook. His wounds bled freely, soaking the dirt beneath him. But he kept firing because stopping meant certain death for the men behind him. The attackers pushed closer, breaking through the first 2 layers of bodies. Ben Salamon fired again and again, fighting to slow them even as the numbers overwhelmed his field of fire. He could hear gunshots. He could hear screaming. He could hear the desperate pounding of enemy boots. He continued firing until the belt grew short. The machine gun clicked dry after the final round left the barrel. There was no more ammunition. The last belt was empty. The heavy gun was silent for the first time since the attack had begun. Salamon knew that the end had arrived. The Japanese soldiers screamed as they rushed the foxhole from every direction. Ben Salamon did not surrender. He did not hide. He reached for his pistol. He pulled it from its holster and fired into the charging attackers. Every shot found a target. He kept firing until the pistol was empty, then threw the weapon at the nearest soldier. More attackers climbed over the barricade of bodies. Salamon grabbed a knife. He rose to his feet with his last strength. He fought the soldiers hand to hand. He slashed. He swung. He struck with everything he had left. Blood poured from his wounds. The enemy stabbed him again and again. Bayonets tore through his uniform. Blades pierced his skin. Still he fought. Still he refused to fall. The attackers swarmed him until he disappeared beneath a mass of bodies. Even then, he struggled against them until his strength finally faded and his heart beat its last. The foxhole fell silent. The machine gun stood still. The lone defender was gone. But the Japanese soldiers who survived that final assault did not celebrate. They stood in stunned disbelief, staring at the carnage around them. 98 of their comrades lay dead in a semicircle around the foxhole. Many more wounded crawled across the field, and in the center of that terrible scene lay a single man, a dentist who had become a warrior, a healer who had become a wall between life and death, a man who had fought until nothing was left inside him. For hours after his fall, the battle continued elsewhere across the Tanapag Plain, but the area around the foxhole remained strangely quiet. The Japanese troops who had survived were too exhausted and too shaken to push farther. Salomon had broken the momentum of the Bonsai charge in that sector. He had bought his regiment enough time to regroup. He had saved countless lives. Later that afternoon, the American counterattack swept across the plain, retaking the ground that had been lost during the Bonsai assault. Soldiers moved among the fallen, looking for survivors. When they reached the foxhole, they saw the heavy machine guns still pointed toward the enemy. They saw the bodies piled high like sandbags. They saw Captain Ben Salomon lying in the dirt covered in wounds. And they saw something that left them speechless. They counted the dead enemies around him. 5, 10, 20, 50, 98. 98 enemy soldiers killed by one man. The barrel of the heavy machine gun had warped from the heat. The ground was soaked in blood. The foxhole looked like the last stand of a man who had refused to lose. The commanding officer looked at the scene, unable to speak. He opened his notebook and began writing a recommendation for the highest military honor in the nation. A Medal of Honor recommendation for Captain Benjamin Lewis Salomon. It should have been simple. It should have been immediate. It should have been undeniable. But instead, the recommendation would vanish. It would be rejected. And for half a century, the name of the dentist of Saipan would be buried in silence. The commanding officers who inspected the foxhole on July 8, 1944, knew instantly that they were standing before one of the greatest acts of battlefield courage in the entire war. The evidence lay scattered around them in a brutal circle. The heavy machine gun warped from heat, the empty ammo belts piled at the base, the blood-soaked earth. The lone defender slumped forward with dozens of wounds, and the bodies of 98 enemy soldiers forming a ring around him like a terrible monument to his final stand. The regimental commander understood what he was looking at. He understood that this was not luck and not chance. This was bravery in its purest form. He wrote the Medal of Honor recommendation, immediately believing that no officer alive could deny what had happened here. But the truth would prove far colder than the battlefield where Salomon had fallen. Instead of being honored, his nomination struck an invisible wall buried deep inside the rules of war. When the recommendation reached Major General Robert Richardson, it was rejected before it had a chance to rise any higher. The reason was not based on valor or on evidence. It was based on a single clause hidden in the Geneva Convention. Under international law, medical personnel wearing the Red Cross were considered non-combatants. They were allowed to carry a weapon only to defend themselves, and only for the protection of their wounded patients. Anything more than that could be judged as offensive action which the laws forbade. Richardson studied the report. He saw the 98 enemy bodies. He saw the use of the heavy machine gun. He saw the sheer scale of destruction one man had inflicted. And he concluded that Ben Salomon had violated the rules of war by fighting back too effectively. Richardson argued that a doctor could not legally operate a machine gun. He believed that awarding the Medal of Honor to a medical officer who had killed so many enemy soldiers might call into question the neutrality of medical personnel in all future wars. In his eyes, Salomon had crossed a legal line. Therefore, the recommendation was denied. It was a cold decision made far from the battlefield where men had fought for their lives. It ignored the fact that Salomon had acted only after the front line collapsed. It ignored the fact that he had been defending 30 wounded men who could not walk on their own. It ignored the overwhelming reality that he had fought because there was no other choice. The file was closed. The recommendation shelved, the story of his final stand set aside by bureaucracy. It was a cruel injustice. The men he had saved returned home. They lived long lives. They raised families. They grew old. And with every passing year, the memory of the dentist who saved them faded further into silence. As time moved on, the world entered new conflicts: Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf. Generations of soldiers fought and died, while the name Ben Salaman slipped into near obscurity, remembered only by the few surviving veterans who knew what he had done. Then fate struck again. In 1973, a massive fire swept through the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, burning millions of military files. The stored documents of countless soldiers were turned to ash. Among the destroyed files was the original Medal of Honor recommendation for Captain Benjamin Lewis Salaman. For a moment, it seemed as if his story would vanish, forever lost to flame and time. But some stories refused to die. In the late 1990s, a dentist named Dr. Robert West, a graduate of the same dental school, Salaman, once attended, heard rumors of a forgotten hero from Saipan. The idea of a dentist who had become a one-man fortress struck him deeply. He felt a personal obligation to uncover the truth. What began as curiosity soon became a mission. Dr. West gathered every trace of information he could find. He searched surviving archives. He contacted military historians. He spoke to aging veterans who remembered the fight. Slowly, he pieced together the missing threads. He found copies of witness statements that had escaped the fire. He found casualty reports. He found the original diagrams of the foxhole and the ballistic analysis conducted in 1944. The deeper he dug, the clearer the truth became. Salaman had not violated the Geneva Convention. He had defended a medical aid station that had been overrun. He had fought only because the wounded behind him would have been massacred. He had used the heavy machine gun because it was the only weapon capable of stopping the massive Bonsai assault. Every bullet he fired had been in defense, not offense. He was not a violator of the rules of war. He was their embodiment, a healer forced into the role of warrior to save lives. Dr. West and his team presented the evidence to the army, but every appeal met resistance. The Pentagon did not want to reopen a case from more than half a century earlier. Officials dismissed the efforts. They advised him to stop. They insisted the issue was closed. But Dr. West refused to quit, just as Salaman had refused to leave his position. He gathered support from congressmen. He contacted veterans organizations. He published articles. He turned the forgotten dentist into a growing symbol of overlooked heroism. Finally, after years of pressure, the case reached the Secretary of the Army. The evidence was reviewed in full. The truth could no longer be denied. The earlier ruling had been based on a misunderstanding of the Geneva Convention. Salaman had acted within his rights. His heroism was unquestionable. His courage unmatched. His sacrifice undeniable. After 58 long years, justice was finally coming. On May 1, 2002, the White House held a ceremony to correct a wrong left untouched since 1944. Salaman had no wife, no children, no direct descendants, so a distant relative, the same Dr. West who had fought for his honor, stood in the Rose Garden to receive the Medal of Honor on Salaman's behalf. The sun shone down. Marines stood at attention. The President read aloud the citation, describing the 76 wounds, the 98 enemy soldiers, the impossible stand of a lone medical officer who chose duty over life. The Medal of Honor was placed in the hands of Dr. West, closing the final chapter of World War II with the recognition of a man who had waited nearly 6 decades for the honor. He earned in a single hour of impossible courage on the island of Saipan. The Medal of Honor now rested in the hands of Dr. Robert West, yet the meaning of that moment stretched far beyond the Rose Garden ceremony held on May 1, 2002. It was more than a symbolic correction. It was the restoration of a story that should have been carved into the memory of the nation, from the moment the guns fell silent on Saipan. Captain Benjamin Lewis Salaman had stood alone against a tide of destruction, and for nearly 60 years the world had been denied the chance to understand the depth of his sacrifice. but now at last his name was spoken with the honor it deserved. After the ceremony, the Medal of Honor was placed on permanent display at the University of Southern California School of Dentistry, where Salomon had once walked the halls as a quiet student who believed his future would be filled with root canals cleanings and gentle smiles. The medal sits behind clear glass glowing softly under the lights, while students pass by carrying books worrying about exams and planning their careers just as Ben once had. They see his photograph showing a calm man in wire-rimmed glasses with a faint smile, and they do not see a warrior. They see a dentist who could have been one of their classmates. They see someone ordinary, someone peaceful, someone who never expected to become a legend, yet deeper reflection reveals something both unsettling and inspiring. Ben Salomon's story shows how little any person truly knows about themselves until fate reaches into their life and demands a choice. In 1937, he was a student working toward a comfortable career. In 1940, he was drafted and discovered he had a gift for marksmanship that he had never imagined. In 1944, he found himself inside a medical tent, surrounded by wounded boys who depended entirely on him for survival. And when the front line collapsed and the Bonsai Charge turned night into chaos, he was forced into a moment that revealed the truth of his character. He had always been a healer. He had always been gentle. But when the world fell apart, he became something else, something forged by necessity, something that all people imagine but few ever embody. He became a protector willing to give everything to ensure others lived. The medal displayed in the dental school is more than a tribute. It is a reminder that ordinary people can rise to extraordinary heights when there is no one else left to stand in the way of darkness. His classmates had once described him as the last person who would ever be involved in violence. Yet on Saipan, he fought with a ferocity unmatched by anyone who wore the uniform during that long night. Students who walk past the medal do not see the battlefield in their minds, but the story rests quietly inside that glass, waiting to remind them that courage is not something born from aggression. Courage is born when a person decides that fear will not dictate their actions. When they decide that others matter more than themselves. Salomon's actions teach that even a man trained to repair teeth and calm anxious patients can become a wall against an army if the situation demands it. His life and death reveal something terrifying and beautiful about the human spirit. Terrifying because it shows how extreme the world can become. Beautiful because it shows how far one person can go to defend life even at the cost of their own. The documents recovered by Dr. West, the witness testimonies, the battlefield reports, and the diagrams all reveal a simple haunting truth. Ben Salomon did not want to be a hero. He did not seek glory. He did not charge into battle for recognition. He fought because there were 30 wounded men behind him who could not lift a weapon. He fought because the front line had crumbled and the path to those helpless soldiers lay wide open. He fought because if he abandoned his position, every wounded man in that tent would have been butchered without hesitation. His transformation from healer to warrior was not a choice made from pride. It was a choice made from duty, and for that he paid the highest price. The island of Saipan is quiet now. The battles are long over. The ravines no longer echo with gunfire. The beaches no longer run red. Vegetation has grown over the old foxholes. Tourists walk the paths once soaked with blood. The wind that blows across the Tanapag Plain no longer carries the screams of soldiers, but carries instead a silence that holds memories buried beneath the earth. Somewhere under that soil lie the remains of the battlefield where a single dentist made his stand. The world around it has changed, but the weight of his actions remains. The United States had closed the book on its greatest war many decades earlier, yet the final page was not truly written until the medal was placed in Dr. West's hands. It completed a chapter of history that had been left unfinished. It restored honor to a man who never lived long enough to know that his courage would be remembered by future generations. His story echoes today not because he killed 98 enemy soldiers, but because he showed the world that heroism can exist inside the most unexpected hearts. He showed that tragedy and bravery can coexist in one moment. He showed that sometimes to save lives, a healer must pick up a weapon. And though he never returned home and never opened the dental practice, he once dreamed of his name now stands among the greatest acts of valor ever recorded by the nation he served. Students who see the medal may not fully understand the depth of the man behind it. They may not picture the smoke, the screams, the collapsing foxholes, or the bonsai charge that threatened to wipe out an entire regiment. But as they look at his face, they can sense something powerful. They see a man who discovered his true character only when the sky fell. A man who became the last line of defense when no one else remained. A man who proved that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep fighting despite it. Ben Salomon did not seek fame. He did not return home to applause. He did not live to hear the words of gratitude from the men he saved. But because of his stand, those men lived, they married, they had children. They grew old. Their families exist because he refused to leave that machine gun. 98 attackers fell before they could reach the wounded. One man stopped an army. One man saved countless futures. One man gave everything he had. Today he stands honored as he always should have been. Captain Benjamin Lewis Salomon, the dentist of Saipan, a healer, a warrior, a man who proved that even in the darkest hours humanity can rise to impossible heights. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.